Good morning, everyone, to the European Forum for Disaster Risk Reduction, and in particular to the session about how can science and technology practically help us in better assessing disaster impacts. My name is Vitor Silva. I'm the Seismic Risk Coordinator at the Global Earthquake Model Foundation, and I would like to talk to you about challenges in exposure and vulnerability terminology and disaster risk assessment with some examples about how the global earthquake model is helping improving our knowledge about earthquake risk and also contributing to other perils. So just a little bit of background on what we do, so I can better explain some of the topics I'll be discussing in this presentation. So GEM is a not-for-profit organization recognized by the United Nations, and we focus on the calculation and communication of earthquake risk globally with a strong impact in capacity building. We have several regional programs, around the world, bilateral collaborations, in which we work with local experts, international scientists in the development of seismic hazard, exposure, seismic risk, and vulnerability. So just focusing on some challenges on exposure terminology. And exposure, it's basically the component that is common to all perils, not just natural hazards, but also anthropogenic hazards. So in 2018, GEM released this global earthquake, global exposure model. Basically, for all the countries around the world, we have developed exposure models that characterize the number of buildings, distributed across several building classes, also the occupants, the population, and also, for example, the economic value of the different components of the building. The problem is when we were developing this model, and this model is being used by several institutions, obviously there are several challenges in terms of terminology, in terms of making sure that if I'm classifying buildings, for example, in Indonesia, and then if I'm characterizing buildings in Mexico, I need to make sure that the same language is being used, that scientists from both countries, disaster risk managers from both countries will be able to speak the same language. So we needed to come up with a common language, a common classification system for the building stock. And this is how the global uniform classification system, what we call this GEM taxonomy, was developed with contributions from more than 200 local experts and international scientists globally. This is basically the DNA of buildings. So basically, we asked several international experts, several local experts, risk managers, structural engineers about what are the main features that we need to classify in the building stock, in the built environment, if we want to do disaster risk assessment, and understanding that the results of this disaster risk assessment will have to be used for disaster risk reduction. So these were the 13 attributes that were identified by this group of experts. So obviously some basic information like the height of the building, the date of construction, the main construction material, but also information, for example, about the type of roof and whether there is a basement, which are important attributes to classify buildings against their vulnerability for floods or storms. So this is more or less how the taxonomy works. So we have various attributes, various categories, and then each category has a fixed number of options. You follow these options, you classify your building stock, and then you have your building stock in the same language, classified in the same manner as other building stocks in other parts of the world. Obviously, there are still several issues when it comes to terminology. Basically, in different parts of the world, for example, confined masonry might mean slightly different structures. So an online glossary with images, with videos, with text describing every one of these concepts has been created, and this has helped a lot. Different groups in different parts of the world classifying their building stock and then liaising with other scientists, with other experts to complement their exposure information with vulnerability and disaster data. For example, now using that global exposure model that I was mentioning previously, if we classify the entire planet, the entire global building stock using the same taxonomy, the same terminology, then it's possible for us to start understanding the drivers of risk at the global scale. For example, at the global scale, we understand now that almost 30% of the building stock is comprised by masonry, which is one of the most fragile types of construction. There's also a significant amount of, for example, adobe or mixed construction, which usually also tend to be quite informal construction. So more than 50% of the building stock in the world comprised by informal or non-engineer building classes. If we also look about how this is distributed at the global scale, in this map that we see here, we see two variables. We see the peak ground acceleration, and this basically reflects whether the seismic hazard is high or not. And we can see it here on the bottom. On the vertical axis, we have the number of buildings. So for example, every time that you see this color in this map, it means that we have a lot of buildings and also high seismic hazard. And we see places like that, for example, in the subduction areas in the west of South America, obviously around the Himalaya belt, okay, in the Middle East. So these are basically the places that we can now pinpoint, and we know they are hotspots of risk. We have high concentration of population and building stock, and also relatively high earthquake hazard. Using this taxonomy now, it is possible also for us to do a disaggregation and understand what are the types of building classes that I have in these different regions. Because if I know what are the type of building classes, I can design my risk mitigation measures according to the properties that I have in the region. For example, to see here an example for the Middle East. For this 13 countries, the annual losses, average annual losses that you see on these maps basically include losses caused by earthquakes and floods. So not just seismic hazard, also earthquake, also flood hazard. And we can see basically across the different regions, what is the main construction material that we have, since the building stock was classified according to this uniform taxonomy. And we can also see on the map on the right, also the type of a number of stories, the height of the building stock. So this is on the exposure, but I would like also to mention something else about changes in vulnerability terminology. And in my opinion, vulnerability is even more complex than exposure, because again, if you're talking with different experts, it's also quite different. The type of analysis, the type of risk metrics that we might want to use. So what do you mean by vulnerability? Are we talking about vulnerable groups, socioeconomic vulnerability, disabled minorities? Or are we talking about economic losses, about the physical impact, about damage, or more on the human component, fatalities, injured population left homeless and displaced? So at the global earthquake model, we have vulnerability and fragility functions for the majority of these metrics. And we have tried to classify this as much as possible without ambiguity to make sure that then the associated risk results are also clearly identified. So just to give you here an example for Costa Rica. So the building stock in Costa Rica at the smallest available administrative level has been classified using a common terminology, and this was done in collaboration with several local experts from the country. You can see in this list here the list of building classes. So from reinforced concrete, wooden buildings, confined masonry, some precast buildings. And for each one of these building classes, we also need to make sure that we have a vulnerability function or a fragility function, and this vulnerability function needs to match exactly the building class that I have on the exposure. And this is also quite important because the fact that often we have different terminologies between exposure and vulnerability might also affect which vulnerability functions we might use on the exposure side. And combining these two components, now I can have here disaster risk results. So basically average annual losses, problem maximum losses, identify the regions in the country where I expect highest risk, and that's probably where we should focus on disaster risk reduction. Just to finish, I also wanted to mention that it is also quite important for us to make sure that also in terms of the risk metrics which are going to be produced, the terminology and the expectations from the end users, decision makers are also met. For example, in this profile here, this is for a specific event in Quito, and this is in Spanish, but basically the type of outputs, the type of metrics that are produced are very different if we're talking about, for example, emergency responders, or for example, long-term planners. In this particular case, this is an earthquake of magnitude 6.5 near the capital of Ecuador. So some of the metrics here, including, for example, the displaced people, number of hospital beds, the debris that would be generated, or the water that would be necessary in the following days, are metrics which were produced using appropriate vulnerability functions. But for example, in this case, For another event near Santiago in Dominican Republic, there was a stronger focus on economic losses, on the impact in terms of the number of damaged buildings, basically already thinking about the funds for the reconstruction and also for the recovery in the long term. Finally, I just want to mention that it is also quite important to make sure that the disaster loss data is also compatible with the exposure and vulnerability, because this type of information, for example, using here the example for China, is used to validate models. So if we make sure that the disaster loss data is also compatible with the vulnerability data, I can now repeat past events, which is what I'm repeating here, several events for China, in making sure that I can validate my models. So this is my last slide, just how is GEM contributing to understanding risk. So producing uniform methodologies, uniform exposure models, uniform terminology for vulnerability and also risk profiles. All this information is publicly available. All this information is open access, so other scientists, other decision makers can use this information and can use the ingredients to tailor the analysis to their own needs. And these uniform data sets can also be used not just for seismic hazard, but on the particular case of the exposure, it can also be used for other perils, like the examples I showed for flood. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention. And I will now pass the word to my colleague, Bill Ho.
Thank you very much, Victor. I think if you have any questions, just please raise those, and then Victor will come back and address those after the presentation is done. So let me share my screen. So I hope you can see my screen clear. So good morning, everybody. My name is Bill Ho. I'm from the Asian Disaster Preparedness Center based here in Bangkok, Thailand. We're deeply privileged to be here to share some of our experiences on this very interesting and pertinent topic on the use of historical data for risk assessment or risk modeling. I would like to have a bit more discussion on this subject with you. So my presentation will be brief, and I welcome any questions or comments after the presentation is done. So a brief introduction about ADPC, or Asian Disaster Preparedness Center. We're an intergovernmental organization based in Thailand that has been in operation in the Asia and the Pacific region for more than 35 years now. Our work has been focusing on providing the evidence for governments and other stakeholders to better understanding their risk environment, to support them to strengthen their system to manage the risk, and to apply the scientific understanding of risk and systems to line ministries such as education, national development planning commissions, agricultural, transport, etc., to ensure that they can conduct risk-informed development planning process and operation. We also facilitate the exchange of knowledge and learning among countries in Asia-Pacific region and also with other parts of the world. So it is really under this context that I'm here today. So in terms of our operation or our work on risk assessments, throughout the years, we have conducted numerous assignments on risk assessments and risk modeling throughout the region. The assessments were done either at the national level, at the state or the provincial level, at the city level, or even for industrial estate park, where we have gathered a lot of best practices and lesson learned. And I would like to share some of the challenges and solutions that we have used today to address those challenges. So the most common challenge that we have seen from the work on the risk assessment is the lack of historical data or not being able to locate the data. A lot of time, other ministries and agencies might have the data that we need, but the information is not known, or the data are in a very different format or standard. In some part of the world, some of the data and information that we need are considered sensitive to the governments, and therefore additional requests and permissions were needed in order to get access to those historical data and information. And very often, due to the coordination issues among different government ministries and agencies, it will take a long time to get the right permission to use some of the much needed data for our risk assessment work. And because we're talking about historical data, the authenticity and also the validity are also a big concern when we need to use them as an input for our risk assessment or risk modeling. So these are some of the very common challenges that we have observed throughout the years when it comes to using the historical data for risk assessment. Now I would like to share some of the solutions that we have used in some of our work in the region that address those challenges, and some of future or potential solutions that we'd like to advocate for in order to address those challenges as well. So I think the most effective solution so far for us is to have a national disaster damage and loss database. I think Victor also touched upon that slightly in his presentations. I think for our experiences in countries like Laos, PDR, in Indonesia, in Mongolia, in Nepal, in other countries where such systems already existed, getting access to historical data and valid historical data become very easy through this kind of national mechanisms. And of course, we also have the opportunity to use remote sensing data or satellite-derived data to fill in the gap where the historical data is just not available or reliable. We found that using the remote sensing or satellite data is a very promising way to serve as input into risk assessment. So I'll actually give you an example of such practice in my last slides for today. We also like to advocate some other solution, which currently is probably not in practice in the region, in terms of looking at having a national standard on data. I think a lot of people probably have a similar feeling that having a national standard on data will make everyone's life much easier, not only for risk assessments or risk modeling, but for so many other purposes as well, such as the reporting to the various different global framework, like Sendai framework, SDGs, or even looking at the sort of monitoring evaluations of the implementations of national strategy on disaster risk reduction. Of course, in addition to having a national disaster damage and loss databases, we also like to recommend to go one step further to include geotagged data in the systems. I do believe that this will be a very good option and actually an easy option to add into some of the existing systems such as the Disinventar Sendai and others. So these are some of the solutions that we have used in our work, and also looking at some of the solutions that we would like to advocate for in terms of addressing the challenge of accessing some of the historical data. So going back to what I earlier mentioned in terms of looking at the use of remote sensing and satellite-derived data as a replacement or as in place of historical data, I would like to use as an example in terms of looking at this sort of regional structure we call the Sentinel Asia. So Sentinel Asia is a regional mechanism that's for Asia Pacific, with currently more than 100 members that include national space agencies and other ministries and technical agencies. And we're very fortunate that ADPC is also part of the mechanisms. And what the mechanism is for is that whenever there's a disaster strike, member countries or member agencies can request a technical support from Sentinel Asia to provide maps, to provide satellite imageries, to help them in terms of looking at emergency response. So based on the information supplied by Sentinel Asia, they can have a more effective emergency response in the region. So in specific, what the data that Sentinel Asia can provide to the requesting countries or agencies includes, of course, satellite imagery, of course, given that the data has to be permitted by the data provider, and value-added images with extractions of disaster-affected areas or coverage areas. They can also provide on-site digital camera images if they're available. They can provide wildfire, hotspot information and data. They can provide rainfall, either short-term or long-term information and data. They can also provide other meteorological satellite imagery and data. So these kind of information for us can be used very easily in other situations as a replacement, as in place of the historical data that we might need for future risk assessments for modeling as well. So we felt that this kind of arrangement, I think that other parts of the world also has it. Like in Europe, you have the European Space Agency that does provide this kind of services as well. So this is actually a very practical and easy solutions that we can really use to address sort of some of the challenges in terms of looking at getting access of historical data for risk assessments and risk modeling. So with that, I would like to end my presentation, and we're more than happy to welcome any questions or comments. If there are none, I can hand over the floor to Mrs. Eva Trasferini from SEMA Foundation to continue the presentation. The floor is yours, Eva.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you for your introduction, and good morning to everyone. My name is Eva Trasferini. I come from CIMA Research Foundation. CIMA is a research foundation in Italy, and it is active in several fields. And among them, I would like to mention disaster risk reduction. I'm sorry, and civil protection. Within CIMA, I'm the head of the unit for disaster risk assessment and loss data. And today I would like to share with you some piece of experience that we gain in with floods. And in doing this, of course, we know that disaster risk loss data are not useful only for this topic, but of course, we wanted to understand how these kind of information could be helpful in this connection, and try to understand if we can have some advice or some recommendation in order to improve or refine the collection of this information for these specific purposes. And for doing this, I would like to start from something that at least apparently can seem a bit far from our topic, but from one consideration that is a bit old, but of course we hope that this can improve more and more, but it can be always a potential problem. And is that according to the GAR 2015, only a fraction of the actual direct losses are actually collected in national databases or international databases. Do these pose a problem for our evaluation? Let's say the lack of a complete coverage of the actual events pose problems in the risk assessment process. In doing this, I'm presenting now the work done within our unit, and I'm presenting also something that was developed by colleagues of mine, and more precisely in this case I'm presenting the results of an experiment made by my colleague Tatiana, and she tried to understand how risk assessment is impacted by considering or not a part of the information. In doing this, she made a synthetic experiment, identifying a synthetic series of events, and then picking up only a limited amount of events, mimicking somehow the process of data collection. And she compared these the results that she obtained in terms of risk metrics like like average annual loss or the shape of the probable maximum loss curve. When comparing three different situations, let's say an analysis made only on historical data, the one that you can see in red, an analysis on also with a projection on the future, but based on the same kind of information, and also introducing in the historical part of the analysis all the potential events that could be observed. And of course, she obtained results that are quite different when considering these three sets of information. You may say that this is, of course, only a synthetic experiment, but we had the possibility to compare these results also to a real case. We as CIMA are involved in the last years in several activities of several projects dealing with the definition of risk profiles at the national level, mainly with for floods and droughts, but I'll focus on floods, and mainly in Africa. In this case, I will refer to the experience that we had with the UNDRR for the definition, as I was saying, of risk profiles for flood, and more precisely for Zambia is the case study that we decided to pick up for our analysis. And in this case, on all these reports, we use an approach that is fully probabilistic, that comes from the global circulation models, going through hydrological modeling, hydraulic modeling, up to the definition of a long series of event scenarios, and the risk metrics are evaluated through the convolution of impacts associated to each single event scenario, of course, going through the evaluation of exposure and vulnerability. And doing this, we were able to repeat the same kind of experiment that we saw before, and we obtain, and in this case, historical data came from the national data present in the Desinventar database for the period from 2000 to 2017, and we observed similar results to the synthetic ones. So we were confirmed in our analysis that this, let's say, lack of part of the information can affect severely our results. But we have also to consider that this is not the only element that can affect the results of our analysis. Of course, if we consider changes in climate conditions, of course, we can have changes in risk conditions, and of course, they reflect in the results too. And at the same time, and another very important element is the changes in urbanization, in population distribution in the area. These are all elements that can affect very severely the results that we can obtain. Here you can see the differences in terms of EML curves for the different situations, the historical analysis, the analysis only in current climate, but with the modeling approach and so on, introducing all the different aspects. But does this mean that we have to substitute the historical analysis with the modeling one? Of course not. It means only that we have to choose very carefully the activities for which we introduce, that we use the historical data. Of course, one of the main elements that we can refer to is the one of calibration, both the calibration in terms of the physical description of the event event, but also, for instance, in terms of calibration of vulnerability curves. Of course, in order to do this, we need proper loss information. It means that we need information on spatial distribution, let's say the footprint of the event, but also data that are suitable disaggregated in terms of economic sectors involved or other characteristics of the exposure that is linked to the impact that can help us in properly calibrate the several aspects of this process. A good example, it's an example that is near to me, but of course it's not the unique one, but it's the floodcut system in Italy that was built by the Civil Protection Department and the Ministry of Environment in Italy in answering to the directives of the EU directives on floods. And this is a good disaggregation of data on damages and the possibility to include information on flood footprints. And we saw examples of the use of this data set for the calibration of susceptibility models, for vulnerability models, and also for the calibration of rapid mapping of impacts of floods. But at the same time, we see the same problem in gaps of the information coming from the, let's say, the actual situation and the international databases. There's also a problem of coverage of the events at this level. It means that not all the events that are that can be recorded at the local level are usually integrated at this point in this kind of system. This means that we are looking for the description of high frequency and low impact events. And these are very important for a proper risk assessment process. In order to do this, of course, we need to include also the local level in the collection process. And in order to do this, we have to define some tools that are accessible also to to high qualified personnel that could help know some of the information, but without knowing all the complexity of the proper data collection. And also we need for actions on awareness raising on the importance of collecting this information. And we think that in trying to work also in this line, let's say in the inclusion of the local level in the data collection process, that this could significantly improve the quality and the suitability of DLD data for the calibration process in the risk assessment overall process. This was my last slide for you for today, and for now I thank you for your attention, and of course I'm here for any questions. If any, I see something on the okay, no question actually in the chat. So now I can give the floor to my colleagues, Mr. Taina Haninkoski and Mr. Jari Hankonen. I hope that I pronounced them well.
Great, thanks very much. Yes, like Eva said, my name is Taina Hanhikoski, and I work as a senior specialist on international relations at the Finnish National Rescue Association.
Good afternoon. My name is Jari Honkanen, and I'm a senior specialist in the Finnish Ministry of the Interior Department for Rescue Services. It has been a very interesting and informing session, hearing that we are trying to find answers for similar kind of questions in different countries. Or what do you think, Taina?
Yeah, I mean, it's been super interesting, and I really think that our colleagues have raised some really interesting points, and it's always such a pleasure to hear colleagues from different countries share their experience, and I think they are really demonstrating well how critical collecting data and data actually is.
I agree. Our idea in this discussion is to present the topic from the data users and decision makers' point of view, since all decision making is based on data. Reliable data is one of the most important things that we need in order to reduce and manage disaster risks effectively. And as a consequence of this, we in the Ministry of the Interior have recognized the need to develop the data management structure what comes to the disasters, economical losses, and disaster risk reduction related information.
Well, I mean, I always thought that we already have quite good systems in Finland already. I mean, how can you possibly improve them?
Well, we can look this theme from different aspects. And as a national disaster risk reduction coordinator, the ministry has raised the question, among others, if we have all the essential existing information in our use. For example, when reporting to the annual sender reporting system, and further, if the collected information and data needs to find a wider audience who could benefit from the data.
So with data, it's also like marketing 101, you know, like finding your audience.
Right. Further relevant topic is how open the data is. According to the Finnish legislation, all data is free and open. Of course, there are several factors which may keep the documents or data restricted, but the baseline is that the data is available for everyone.
Okay, so when we talk about data management, we need transparency, which is of course very important, but then accessibility is the key to usability, I would say. What else have you thought about if we think about data management?
The data should be not just comprehensive and inclusive, open and easily accessible, but it also should be restored and saved so that it can be mined, but it can't be manipulated or changed. Otherwise, the data is not reliable.
Yeah.
As well as data should be compatible, which makes it remarkably easier to use it. These are bases for the usability of the data and the whole data management system. The character of data could be compared with the Legos, if you know the toys.
Yeah.
Right. There are Lego blocks of different sizes and different colors and even of different shapes. Despite of it, all are compatible with each other. You can add or remove components, but it doesn't change the neighboring block or the used block itself. With data, the fantastic thing is that the data unit can be multiplied and shared as many times as you wish, and still the content remains the same, its values don't change.
Yeah, I really like this Lego metaphor. I think it's very suitable. And like you said, decision making is, of course, when it's based on data, that means that the data needs to be reliable and unchanged. But I mean, this kind of system, I don't know what you think, but this kind of system sounds almost like too good to be true on paper. But how would you actually take this into practice and put all these expectations together in practice?
Well, we are now on the way towards it. And the first step is that the Ministry of the Interior has re-established a national network for partners who have sender-related issues in their agenda and responsibility.
That's great.
In this network, we right now have 21 different stakeholders, and later, if so wished, there can be new members in the network. And right now we have 9 ministries, several research institutes, state-owned companies and establishments, and non-governmental organizations like the one you are representing, the Finnish National Rescue Association.
Yeah, that sounds really good. Can you tell us a little bit more about this network and what kind of goals do you have?
Actually, we have defined aims for our cooperation to enhance information exchange concerning the disaster management. The second is to ensure collecting wide and precise data concerning disaster risk management. Third one is to coordinate participation on international activities like this EF DRR right now. And the fourth aim is to enhance implementing national strategies within the disaster risk reduction. And as a result of all this active network, we build resilience in the country. In small country like Finland, networking is a practical tool. With the familiar partners, it is so much easier to reach for big issues like resilience, which is based on reliable data as well.
That's really cool. And this actually reminds me of another Finnish model, which is called the comprehensive security model. This comprehensive security model is it's like a cooperation model for Finnish preparedness. And the idea is that there are different kind of vital societal functions like defense capabilities and security of supply and psychological resilience, for example. And these functions are handled together by authorities, business, NGOs, citizens, etc. And in practice, it means that every stakeholder group is in their own network connected with different kinds of end users and decision makers and businesses, NGOs, everything. And they all are like working towards a common goal, regardless of the topic that they are focusing on, the common goal being resilience and preparedness, of course. And this model not only draws from the expertise of the participants, but it also gives the opportunity to the people participating in this model an opportunity to learn from each other and really to utilize the know-how of the members of the group.
Of course, that is essential and very important. In our national Sendai network, we also offer and encourage this possibility to our members to benefit from the network, not just by offering access to data. The network offers a podium for sharing information about ongoing projects, research initiatives, research results about new legislation, and etc. It is a splendid audience when one member is looking for partners or consortium members for projects. When talking about sharing information, for example, in our next meeting, we are going to have presentations from 3 different network members and from 3 different perspectives, namely managing and leading with information and data, climate security, biodiversity loss, and the third one is impacts of climate change and extreme weather events in Finland. And then in the next meeting, there will be some other network members presenting their activities.
I mean, those topics are really interesting, and I personally can't wait for the next meeting of the network. And actually, the last one, the impacts of climate change and extreme events in Finland, that really brings to mind the fact that often when talking with international colleagues, I get a lot of questions about Finland and disaster risk reduction, because we have quite a stable physical environment and our society is stable. But I think the key thing is that we do not forget that no society is immune to disasters. What do you think?
You are quite right there. No one is immune. In Sendai framework, we often talk about industrializing societies and about natural disasters which these societies face. Above these, there are other kinds of disasters as well. And thinking back to Finland, in our latitude, we have not experienced earthquakes or massive floodings sweeping whole villages with water, nor have we experienced ultimate long-lasting storms. But our society is still fragile and vulnerable to disasters. And do you know, or could you guess what might be one of the biggest threats in societies like Finland is?
That's a tough one. That there would be no electricity to heat the sauna.
Well, actually, that sounds funny, but actually you are very close to the point. It is a blackout.
Okay.
Societies like Finland are highly dependent on technologies and advanced technical services and IT solutions. Despite of good preparedness, sometimes the mother nature beats the human precautions and well-prepared societies by harming the energy and power net, which paralyzes the whole society.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, because our disasters are more technological and hybrid by nature. But can you then tell us, like, how has Finland planned to respond to these kind of events or disruptions that would maybe affect a large area or a lot of people, a great portion of population? And like, what would these solutions mean to Finland in practice?
Yeah, of course, it is easy to write a bucket list for issues in disaster risk reduction. It is more challenging to sit down and really think from different perspectives what the given promises and set aims mean in real life. And to your question, one solution is the Finnish model for comprehensive security, which you just described before.
Okay.
Comprehensive security model is functional and practical in building prevention and preparedness. Another example of these practical solutions are national and international projects, I think. So, and if I remember correct, you have very good experiences from several projects. Could you give some example?
Well, yeah, actually, just last year we had a really good project that us in the Finnish National Rescue Association led and coordinated. It was a project in the Baltic Sea region here in Northern Europe. And in the project, we aimed to create this kind of like a situational picture of volunteerism in civil protection. So we draw data from all 11 Baltic Sea region countries and really looked into how volunteers are linked to the authorities and their systems. And then we also identified barriers and good examples of how to engage volunteers in civil protection activities. And finally, also how to increase the cooperation between authorities and volunteer organizations in order to achieve resilience in the Baltic Sea region, which is the final goal.
Right, that information is really useful, and it is based on research data that you have collected during the project.
Exactly, and I mean, of course, different countries have different systems and different structures, but I really think that in this project, we were able to gather the key data and really gather all the information needed for a reliable situational picture of volunteerism, and also to understand the gaps that we need to fill in the regional cooperation, which I think is really important as well.
Okay, that is now on paper. So what are the practical steps? Have you plans for that?
Yeah, I mean, for us, we really want to maximize the impact of the data that we have collected and take it to practice. So in the project, we created recommendations available in 10 different languages. And now we are taking those into practice, and we have already started to implement the recommendations. For example, creating a working group for volunteers and civil protection authorities to increase the cooperation and have a discussion together on how to improve the situation. But I have a quick question for you, Jari. Are you more of a quantitative or qualitative type of person?
Depends on the situation, probably. A bit of both. Why do you ask that?
Well, I think it's really important to note that we talk about a lot about this hard data and technology, which is of course super important. But I think we also have to consider this qualitative analysis and not to forget the human point of view.
That is a very good point. This is, and actually that is the sort of this cooperation to have the views from the citizens and who are represented by the NGOs, and I think that is really the benefit for our common cooperation.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to look behind the numbers. And when we talk about statistics and data, we often forget what incidents they consist of. And I think it's really easy to collect data and facts and figures and squeeze them into diagrams, but we often forget what is behind the numbers. There is a lot of human side of losses, material losses, damaged cultural heritage, human distress, and unfortunately often also lost lives. And every number and every unit in numbers represent some of these incidents. But I think we have a great opportunity because the data can really open our eyes to see clearer, and that in order to have an effect on these numbers, I think we really have to work on concrete issues and practical stuff. And with that work, I think we are able to affect the numbers, and they will grow smaller. And that, of course, just means that we also have responsibilities when we are analyzing the data. But I think what I'm trying to say is that data without us humans is just data. And I think science and technology are excellent tools for us humans in order to give us input so we can make more risk-informed decisions and help us in disaster risk reduction.
Yeah, that was a very good underlining these human values. It is so true. That's why we are working for safer society and environment. And I think on this note, it's good to end this discussion. We are almost at the end of our time. What do you see as key topics to take home from this discussion?
Well, I think one of the most important things is that we really need to have a thoroughly planned data management system in place, and not to forget that data needs us humans just as much as we need the data. And I think another point would be that this comprehensive security model is a great way to include all stakeholders to work in cooperation on vital societal functions, also in disaster risk reduction. What about you?
Actually, there's not much to add to what you said, but I'd just like to say that the National Sendai Network here in Finland is a good concrete example to work on with DRR related issues and to make the best use of the data relating to it. And now we are closing this session on how can science and technology practically help us in better assessing disaster impacts. Unless there is some time for a couple of questions for any of us.
I think there are no questions at the moment, if I read this chat correctly. But yes, no questions. So I just want to thank you all for joining our chat and also this session.
Thank you, everybody, for listening us and participating. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you, Taina, and thank you, Jari. Actually, we have a few minutes for some conclusions, and I would like to start with a comment to Vitor. And Vitor introduced to us in terms of the importance of terminology for exposure and vulnerability definition that is in the seismic context, but this is a very important topic also when working the multi-hazard context. And we had the possibility at Shima to see the work by Vitor and work on on this data, but actually I would like to understand if Victor has a hint on how this kind of work can be useful also in the connection with the other kind of hazards. I'm talking about floods, but I think also to other kind of hazards, and how this can help in avoiding the duplication of efforts and the duplication of work.
Thank you, Eva. That's actually an excellent question. I think the days of developing disaster risk reduction just for a particular effort are probably gone. Nowadays, we see the United Nations, of course, but for example, the European Union, that if you want to retrofit the building, you have to reduce, you have to improve the energy efficiency. If you want to reduce flood risk, you also have to take into account other perils. So this brings us to a problem. Okay, let's tackle many perils. So are we going to do different risk assessment for each one of these perils? Are we going to do a little risk assessment here for earthquakes, and then for floods, and then for cyclones, and then for droughts? If we do this, this might be actually very dangerous. It might lead to very biased results. Let's see that, for example, on the earthquake hazard, we used one exposure model, and then for the flood, we use another exposure model. Different exposure models. So perhaps the value is going to be different. The age, the vintage of the building stock is going to be different. The assets, the infrastructure that is going to be covered might be different. So you could end up with results that indicate that earthquake risk is, for example, higher in a particular region when maybe it's not. It's just that basically there's no agreement between the exposure models. One, for some reason, is much higher than the others. And the reason I'm making this huge introduction is actually to try to also make a challenge to the people that might be listening to us, to try to really avoid this duplication of efforts when it comes to exposure modeling. In my maybe not so humble opinion, we should do the work once and do it right and make sure that we take into account all possible perils. And at the global earthquake model, despite our name, we do try to take that into account. So on that classification system I presented, we took into account specific attributes which are actually not relevant for earthquakes, but are extremely important for flood risk, for cyclones, for other perils, tsunami, that are extremely important. So to make sure that if someone else from other institutions, from the local experts, that quite often, for example, for some of the countries, they tell us, thank you for this, but we're not that worried about earthquake hazard, but we're extremely worried about flood hazard, for example, to make sure that that information is usable. So just a plea, just a request to the people that might be listening to us now and also in the future. When it comes to exposure modeling for disaster risk assessment, I think it is quite important to make sure that people from different perils are in the table and make sure that you take into account all these features so we can develop that exposure model once, and then you can put on top of that different risk analysis. So thank you very much, Eva. And just with this comment, I think we're very close to the time. So unless there are any other questions, I think it is fine for us to close this session. So I just wanted to thank everybody that attended this session, and obviously also thank all the speakers of this session. And I wish everybody a rest of a very good forum about the European Forum on Disaster Risk Reduction. So thank you very much. Okay, so it seems like we actually have a question. I apologize for saying goodbye probably a little bit ahead of time. So the question is, do you estimate error in your risk assessment? I mean, the errors and uncertainties on raw data are multiplied in finite analysis and make it very uncertain. So this is a very good question. I will just mention a very quick comment on this, but maybe then I can also ask Eva to comment on this particular question, since she presented some risk analysis in her presentation. I just wanted to mention that we do take into account all sources of uncertainty, from the seismic hazard, also from the exposure modeling, for example, different sources of information for the different building classes, different infrastructure that might exist in the country, and also uncertainties on the vulnerability. So basically understanding that for this particular hazard intensity, we might not have a single outcome. So this is actually very important, not just to account for these uncertainties, but also to make sure that this is well represented on the risk results. But Eva, do you think you can also comment on this particular question?
Yeah, I think that I have to agree with you. Of course, uncertainties are present in all the elements that we are considering when performing a risk assessment, from the hazard part, the exposure, the vulnerability one, and of course we try to incorporate uncertainty in the evaluation, and then the estimation of error can be done and I would like to go back to my presentation with a connection to calibration. Let's say that this is a very important part, mainly in connection with the calibration of the results, in connection with a single event, and then this can be easily seen, the error attached to this part. Then rather than estimate an error, we prefer to indicate some level of uncertainty linked to this. But of course, as we were saying, uncertainties are present in all the elements that we consider, but anyway, the process of providing the risk assessment is anyway helps us, I think, in order to give the direction of what we can expect and how we should react and how we should act in order to mitigate or avoid some specific criticalities. And I hope that I was not too fast on these, and I hope that I given hint on this topic. And anyway, at this point, I think there's no other questions as popping out. I think that we can close this session, and I thank you again, all the participants, and also the speakers, and also the organization. Thank you very much, and good morning or good afternoon.